My name is Khwezi Gule. The Market Photo Workshop has just informed me that the lift is malfunctioning, so please do not use the lift going down the elevator. Otherwise you might get stuck there. Okay, so just use the stairs. Thank you. Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for coming. My name is Khwezi Gule again. I will be the moderator for this session. And on the panel here with me are Candice Jansen. Actually, I should find out, is it Jansen or Jansen? It's Jansen. Jansen, okay, great. Candice Jansen, who is a fellow at WISER, and she has worked with the UNESCO archive. And then next to me is Akona, is a graduate of the Market Photo Workshop, but also has worked with the Santo Mofokeng archive. And then to my left is Thato Mogotsi, and she is with the Room Gallery, but she also is worked extensively with photographic archives in various media houses. And with that said, I will start. The way that I'm going to do this, and hopefully the participants or the panelists will follow my lead, is that I would like this session to be more conversational. So far we've had presentations, but for this particular session, we decided on a kind of a conversation rather. So there aren't any prepared presentations, but throughout the past 2 weeks or so, we have been sharing certain readings, and we will be referring to these. So hopefully we will not get lost when we refer to these particular readings, which is basically newspaper articles and a couple of essays. Okay, with that said, I would like to just start off by asking the panelists, always starting from my far right to the left, to just say what started their interest in working with photographic archives.
So for me, it's been actually coming at the photography archive through being a practitioner. I come from a photojournalism background in terms of training, and I worked in the non-profit sector for 6 years and was kind of involved in media and public policy at that point. So my interest then in the archive really came from trying to figure out what it is that I wanted to say outside of the kinds of institutions that I was working for. And I really had to begin with my own biography, and that for me was what started it, because I had a photograph of my great-great-great-grandmother, and she worked as a midwife in a rural village called Genadendal in the Western Cape. And I was in the US actually, and then had begun to look at the work of Anne Fisher, who was a German. She kind of fled the Second World War and came to South Africa and established quite a booming photographic business in Cape Town in the 1930s. And amongst the things she photographed, she did a study on Genadendal. And there was, so my family photograph and this archive, photographic archive of Genadendal, was really what began my interest in thinking about not only where do I fit in the visual archive, but also what is the role of the visual in telling history.
Excuse me. I think for me, at first I thought it was just like a practical thing because I am a photographer. I think studying at the photo workshop was kind of the first really thinking about archiving, because I was a course assistant and part of my job was to sort out these images. But then when I think about it, I mean, in the past couple of years I've been thinking why specifically archives, and it has a lot to do with an album that was lost in the family. So when my parents died, they left me with this album and it got lost. And I kind of obsessed about finding these images that no longer exist. I mean, I only have 2 images of my dad and my mom is in my memories. So it's all about memories, I guess, for me.
It's quite interesting that my fellow panelists all have a very sort of a personal point of departure in terms of their relationship to the archive. It's the same for me too. My father was a pretty prolific documenter of our family life. He collected a lot of cameras as well, cameras that sort of offered at the moment what was the closest you could get to an instant image, so Polaroids, and whenever you travel to Asia for business, you'd come back with the latest sort of film camera that was easy to work, very easy to function, and so as a result, I am sitting with my family's wealth of images and photographs that my father took throughout our lives. And to sort of emphasize again on the personal relationship I have to the question of archives and what an archive means, it relates to the fact that what happens to an image when you retrieve it or pull it out of an archive, and how does the story get retold around that image? How does it explode? How does it conceal or reveal certain aspects of a story or a context? But then in terms of my professional relationship to working with archives, it started with working within media, newspaper archives as a picture editor and researcher. And I also became quite invested in the problems that photographers, practitioners of photography were dealing with in terms of archiving their own work and sort of keeping their work safe and you know, safeguarding the copyright around their work. So for me, it was both functional, personal, and very relatable. Yeah.
Okay, finally, I will tell you somewhat what interests me in archives. I have to say that before I started working at the Johannesburg Art Gallery, maybe even during, the issue of the archive for me was not maybe paramount on my mind so much as the artworks that I had to, the physical artworks that I have to deal with that were in the collection. But where I became more interested in archives was when I moved to the Hector Peterson Museum, where there is a certain amount of archives of some of the photographers who documented the Soweto uprising. Now, one of the issues, of course, that keeps coming up in relation to archives and why this panel we decided to put together this panel was about a year ago at the June 16 Interpretation Center, the Market Photo hosted a dialogue with Akona Kenqu was one of the people, and actually Kolega Shange was also part of the discussion, with two photographers, Mike Mzileni and Bongani Nguni. And what came from Bongani Nguni and Mike Mzileni were also two of the photographers that documented the Soweto uprising. And one of the major things that kept coming up in relation to their work is that they felt that public institutions should take the responsibility for archiving their work. And subsequent to that, I met with Lekgetho to discuss how could we think around how this archive of these photographers could be approached, and also the fact that we recognized very early on as well that there are hundreds and dozens of photographers whose works are in their personal storage areas, and probably many of them are in disrepair and so forth and so on. And how does one then go about deciding who is to be archived, and so all of those questions. But on the other hand, there is work that is quite well documented, well archived, and most of it is sitting in public institutions. Now the question with those kinds of artworks is whose works are there and why are those works there? And how accessible are those works? In the sense that, for instance, we were in a panel discussion at the NIHSS, and there was somebody who was working with a particular archive in one of the major institutions in South Africa, and he was saying that there is such a thing as excessive access. So it really made me think about, well, if so much state resources are going to be invested in these archives, what use are they if they're not going to be accessed? And what are the reasons why people feel that they have to withdraw access to these archives? Anyway, but then also there are issues related to privilege, and of course race and gender that pertain to archive. In what ways are archives gendered? In what ways are archives racialized? And just as a starting point, and I don't want us to dwell on the removal of the Goldblatt archive from UCT, but it's just as a starting point to think about all of these cluster of issues that conglomerate around this issue of the archives. And so that is the thinking anyway around this panel. And I know that this is a kind of an elephant, so we're going to have to take little bites of it from different angles, and hopefully by the end of the session we will have whittled it down at least by a quarter. Anyway, so my next kind of question is to the panelists. Okay, so one of the articles is by Jay Pather, and he is basically responding to an article that had been written about how the removal of the artworks from UCT was tantamount to an act of censorship, and that there is a demise of public institutions because universities, they're supposed to be this place of debate and all of that, and removing these artworks from the displays and the halls of the university is basically to curtail that spirit of debate and exchange of ideas and so forth and so on, and basically advocating for everything to remain the same. So then Jay Pather writes this response and saying that, okay, these artworks were purchased at the time when, there was the university community, quote unquote community, was much smaller, and they had a particular access to what these things mean in their cultural context, in that particular cultural context. But if you're adding other voices and other subjectivities to the space, all of these things have got to change, and that conversation actually basically argues has never been had. And that this is an opportunity to actually have now this conversation. And it's not an act of censorship, but it's actually an act of really trying to kickstart that conversation. So I would like to ask the panelists, again as a starting point, what they make of this exportation of the Goldblatt archive to Yale.
I really want to talk about David Goldblatt. Because for me, I think that he is a photographer that I think is yet to be put under political scrutiny. And for me, that's not about undermining the contribution that he made to South African photography, but I think his work needs political scrutiny. An important biographical note to remember about David Goldblatt is that he worked for Anglo-American during apartheid, which enabled him to produce the work that he did. What does that mean? What does it mean for a photographer who comes from that kind of privileged history? And I don't necessarily want to make David Goldblatt exceptional, because I think part of the politics we have to remember around this time of apartheid photography, and of course we know this, but just to state it, is the kind of disparity that existed between white and black photographers. For instance, black and white photographers during apartheid were not as mobile as each other. Even the anti-apartheid movement gave white photographers access to black life. Yet very few black photographers actually took the risk to photograph in white spaces. They did not have the same kind of jobs at the time in the industry. So Goldblatt is an example of the kind of disparity that existed even within what we call anti-apartheid photography. So yes, there's the issue of UCT, and for me that's not primarily of concern. It's actually of concern of putting David Goldblatt under some kind of political scrutiny.
Well, when I first got this email about this talk, I think also reading through the articles, one of the first things that came for me was, is this working? Oh, okay. I kind of made like these notes, right? And firstly, it was privilege. He can decide where the work goes. He has the money, he has the capacity to move it wherever he wants. So there's not much care where the work ends up. And then also kind of the issue around, it feels like it was a state of panic when he did this, without ever actually thinking what he was doing, right? I'm not sure. But I feel like having to move a history that belongs to us and go put it elsewhere takes it out of context. You know, these are our memories. And then once again, we have people looking at us instead of us talking back. So I think that was my kind of thinking around it, that once again, there's this voyeuristic way that will be looked at without us having any conversation with them.